Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Hamish Ford and I teach in film media and cultural studies along with Rebecca. So I'm going to present this week the second in the Represent module, which is called National and World Cinemas. So in this video session I'm just going to take you through some of the key concepts that I'm going to explore in much more detail in the lecture. So this is not a replacement for the lecture, it's more a kind of a prompter and hopefully just a little bit of clarification of the really key points as well. So national and world cinema, these are two connected but importantly also very much different, or in certain ways different, ways to look at representation within film and audiovisual media studies. So who and what is represented in a film? Where and how do they live? What language do they speak? What religion, if any, do they practice? These and many other questions are vital for both national and world cinema studies with different emphases. But also, in addition to those kind of linguistic and cultural representational issues, I guess, is the issue of what representational system the film itself uses. So, to be blunt, what kind of film language does a given film use to show what it shows? So these two interconnected levels of representation very much concern national and world cinema studies in their different ways. To sum up, what we see on screen and how it is filmed. Okay, so the question of cinema as representing national identity. This is a very old way to look at film or film studies. And it's really the question of national cinema. Why would we look at films and the history of cinema through the theme of where the particular film was made? And there are lots of good reasons for this, but there are also some problems too. This is often a way to talk about and justify the existence of cinema beyond Hollywood, including other American films, so films from the United States that perhaps are not Hollywood movies, or indeed the rest of the very large continent or continents of the Americas. But first, a question that theorists in this area ask is, what is the nation? So what do we mean when we say national cinema? What does the national part of that mean? So one of the key theorists here is Benedict Anderson, and another guy as well called Ernst Gellner, writing in the 1890s and 90s, sorry, the 1980s and 90s. Both of these figures stress that nations are very much ideological constructions that seek to forge a link between a self-defined cultural group and the state, and create abstract or imagined communities that we loosely refer to as the nation, or indeed the nation state, which then get passed off as natural, although of course they are not natural. Now that's a quote from Susan Haywood, a key scholar in this area, kind of summing up a lot of that scholarship. So national cinema's elements then, and in some ways that's original sin, I guess we could say, and I'll explore this a lot more in the lecture. The question of nationalist motivation or origins. So, whether a film actually is supposed to reflect a particular version of the nation, and if so, which or whose version. Along with this goes the perennial debate around whether films should be subsidised or funded by the state. And therefore, if they are, do they become a kind of propaganda, a kind of cultural propaganda? Nationalism itself, the more kind of right-wing elements of this, of course, very infamously expressed in some ways through the famous image of Nazi Germany. And then, I guess in a less confronting way, we've got the notion of national cinemas making up, in their plurality, world cinema itself and the variety of world cinema. So the key kind of bogeyman, of course, here, as so often, is German cinema. German cinema is very much a story of early glory, so as in, an incredible filmmaking nation in the 1920s and early 30s. And then, of course, we have the Nazi period, and therefore a kind of permanent stain on the very question of what Germany is. And one of the great German filmmakers of later on, the 1970s and early 80s, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, once said, "Scratch the economic miracle of Germany after the war and you'll find a swastika." So in other words, the old demon of nationalism is still here with us. And the big question there is, what was the Germany to be represented on screen, and why? So big questions of national culture then are things like, what does an Australian cleaner, for example, and a CEO of a large company really have in common? They may speak the same language, but they would speak it in a very different way with different accents, etc. So does the Australian cleaner, for example, have more in common with somebody who does a similar job in Poland? So, if the answer is yes, then straight away the question of national identity is kind of questioned or open to question. So much prominent scholarly literature on national identity argues that no matter how natural it actually seems, it's very much an artificial and historical construct that's sort of fused onto an already existing, though often very diverse culture or cultures, but now stressing inside and outside self and other distinctions. In other words, who is and who is not, quote unquote, Australian, German, etc. So the question of artificial and ultimately violent, because very exclusionary, enforcement of identity. This is, again, the more disturbing aspect of national identity when it comes to the national cinema argument. So national cinema, to sum up, is a real historical phenomenon. In that sense, we should study it. But the risk in studying it is that we can reinscribe a kind of nationalist or cultural, what's sometimes called essentialism. So just assuming what Australia, Germany, Japan, etc. are, and therefore what films should represent them to be. So national cinema as a theme in film studies then is very crucial. And it's not to be lightly dismissed. So filmmakers, and indeed, many people, often live primarily in a particular country, or perhaps countries, with deep ties to those places. Their films will in some ways reflect this, consciously and otherwise. And that's why, of course, we can't just dismiss this concept entirely. To study a film from this point of view emphasises then the role of a film in representing a nation or part thereof and its context. Studies of national cinema analyse the ways in which film has been used to forge, construct, debate and critique national identity. So this is a really kind of interesting question. What sort of vision and opinion, if you like, of the nation do we see in a given film? So at one extreme is state propaganda, where it's kind of seemingly the film is made to celebrate a very conservative definition of the nation based on one particular majority group, perhaps. At the other is a more radical critique of the nation from within. So in the lecture, what I'll do is I'll show clips from two very great films that are different expressions of this tension, I guess we can say. One of them is called The Life of Oharu, by one of the greatest film directors ever to have lived, Mizoguchi Kenji. And in this film we see, in a sense, an exaggerated Japaneseness, an exaggerated sense of national identity in a pre-modern, a feudal incarnation. So in other words, a kind of quote-unquote timeless Japan. But on the other hand, we see a savage critique in the film of the way, in particular, women are treated in that society. We're also going to look at a very controversial film in some ways called Festen, or a clip from this film, which is about a family gathering and then a very difficult, challenging announcement that one of the members makes to the group. And in a sense, this film is also demonstrating kind of qualities of Danish and Scandinavian identity that are almost excessive, and yet at the same time it's turning them inside out and asking us to look at, if you like, the nasty underside or underbelly of this society. So to sum up then, critiques of national cinema, representation and scholarship. National cinema analyses continue. So you'll still see books and articles coming out that are concentrating on a given national cinema. But in many or even most instances, especially in Europe and East Asia, increasingly films just don't come from one country. So it's increasingly artificial to just talk about, Japanese cinema or French cinema, for example. So as an account of how and where films are made, and as an analytical lens, national cinema is increasingly critiqued, seen as kind of out of date. Filmmaking reflects both small and broad forces. So localism, what's happening in your local community. Regionalism, so in our case, maybe the Hunter region, but also beyond Australia, the Asia-Pacific region, plus nations, but less clearly bounded due to the globalised economy, but also the proliferation of global media and the internet, of course. So we all know it doesn't matter if you don't travel very much physically, you do on your screen device. The historical constructedness and contingency of the nation and national cultures is also increasingly emphasised. So does National Cinema Studies risk reinforcing the historical and ideological heritage of the nation itself and overlooking that identity and experience is both smaller and larger than the nation? These are some of the tricky questions that looking at cinema through this lens of national cinema asks, and they're fundamental questions really of representation. So that's part one of the videos for this week. In part two, I'll move to the very closely related topic of world cinema. Thanks.